The story began with a group of people standing in the middle of the city. All of them were gazing up at the sky. Someone among them asked what it was they were seeing. It was narrated that 10 years ago, a massive inverted castle had suddenly appeared above Tokyo. The people watched in awe as the enormous structure floated in the sky. Simultaneously, dungeons began manifesting all over Japan. Triangular structures emerged in places like farm fields and tourist spots. People began awakening to mana. Those gifted with magical talent challenged the dungeons. They gained fame and fortune. A mage's talent was judged by the color of their mana. Most people had aptitude for a single color. Rare individuals could wield two. An example given was Kurosaki Kai, the speaker's younger brother. He possessed both red and blue mana. Kai, a purple-haired young man, was shown grinning confidently at a demon. As the demon lunged to attack, Kai retaliated with a move called Demon Lance. The demon roared in pain as it was struck. It fell to the ground, defeated. Kai picked up a red crystal-like stone from where the demon had landed. The demon's body faded away. In the background, a white-haired figure appeared. He was identified as the protagonist. Kai threw the red crystal-like stone toward the protagonist. He called out for the incompetent to pick it up. It was revealed that Kai was known as the Purple King. He was a powerful mage at level 18. He looked down at the protagonist with disdain. The protagonist narrated that Kai was among the strongest mages. But he, Kai's older brother, was considered an incompetent with no aptitude. He was completely colorless. That made him a rarity in their world. The protagonist, whose level was just 1, had no mana. Yet, he admitted he couldn't give up on becoming a mage. He explained that he worked as a porter. He collected crystal-like stones. Thanks to his brother's pity, he was allowed to join Kai's party. He clung to the hope that one day he might awaken a skill. The scene shifted to a large door. Kai's party members were gathered. One of them identified it as the boss room. Another predicted the boss would be easy to defeat. The large door opened. The party entered the room. Inside, they encountered a being covered in clocks. He was introduced as Kronos, the god of time and space. Kronos' level could not be detected. He gazed at the party. Kai dismissed the threat. He attacked with Demon Lance. Kronos levitated. He calmly watched the incoming attack. He opened a red dark portal and drew a sword. The sword easily deflected Kai's attack. The god glared menacingly at the party. Kai expressed his shock. Kronos' eyes glowed ominously. Suddenly, something approached Kai. In the next moment, Kai's head shattered. Blood gushed everywhere. Kai collapsed. His party members stood in horror. They watched Kai's body fall to the ground. The protagonist was frozen in disbelief. He witnessed the fall. He thought it couldn't be true. Kai, the Purple King, had been defeated in an instant. Kronos loomed menacingly. Two party members turned and ran, calling him a demon. They feared for their lives. But before they could escape, two swords pierced their heads. The swords emerged from small black portals created by Kronos. The protagonist dropped to the ground in shock. Kronos then addressed him. He remarked that he was completely colorless. He smiled. The protagonist stared back in shock. The protagonist clenched his fist. He thought he hadn't achieved anything yet. Determined, he stood and picked up a sword. He was ready to make a stand. Kronos commented on the protagonist's bravery. He asked if he dared face him despite being colorless. The sword trembled in the protagonist's hand. He thought he couldn't give up. Small red-black portals appeared behind Kronos. Kronos declared he would test the protagonist and laughed. Suddenly, the protagonist's right arm was obliterated. Kronos waved his hand. He apologized for going too far. He then snapped his fingers and said, "Rewind." In an instant, the protagonist's body returned to its unharmed state. He was startled. Looking at his healed arm, he thought in amazement that it had recovered. Kronos began charging a fire spell. He said he would now give the protagonist time to think. He unleashed the spell. It was called Hellfire, Flames of Despair. As the fire rushed toward him, the protagonist twitched in fear. Kronos mocked him, asking what he would do. The protagonist considered the sword created by Kronos. He thought it might be effective. He spotted the red sword in the background. He picked it up and lunged through the fire attack. The flames burned his body. He screamed in pain. Kronos searched for the protagonist among the flames. He smiled. But the smile faded. The protagonist emerged from the blaze and pierced Kronos' chest. The protagonist smiled weakly, burned and battered. He thought he had landed a hit. Kronos' expression turned sinister. He used rewind. Everything reset to the moment the protagonist had first taken his stance. Kronos' wound healed. He commented that it had been good entertainment. The protagonist's body disintegrated completely. His sword fell to the ground. He dropped to his knees. He thought it had all been meaningless. Horror filled his eyes. He wondered if this was how he would die then. Something miraculous occurred. A system window appeared. The protagonist was startled. The panel announced it had confirmed the presence of the god of time and space. It was releasing the seal on the black skill. The protagonist questioned what this black skill was. Kronos showed signs of discomfort. The system panel turned golden. It announced the acquisition of the extra skill. Drain. Another panel declared the theft of the skill Rewind. The protagonist had stolen Rewind from Kronos. He widened his eyes as he read the panel. Kronos, now slightly panicked, wondered if it could be true. The protagonist activated the skill Rewind. A black fog surrounded him. Kronos lunged to stop him. Anger and worry appeared on Kronos' face. The system panel declared the execution of regression. Clocks began ticking and reversing time. The scene shifted to a ceiling. Someone woke up in bed. That person, the protagonist, thought desperately about having used Rewind. He wondered what exactly had happened. Looking into a mirror, he was shocked. He saw the reflection of his younger self. After the system panel announced that regression was executing, the clock ticked and time began to rewind. A silhouette of a man wearing a large jacket appeared, a scar visible on his face. He slightly turned his head and said he hadn't been strong enough to defeat Kronos, the god of time and space. He explained that this was why he had entrusted the skill to the listener. He believed that if it was them, then surely they would be able to defeat Kronos, the god of time and space. The man then turned around. At that moment, the scene shifted to the protagonist, who looked into a mirror and noted that he appeared younger. Confused, he reached for his face and asked himself if it was a dream. He looked out of the apartment window, birds were flying outside, and he appeared puzzled. He looked questioningly and remarked that the inverted castle was still white. He wondered how that was possible. It had been pitch black just yesterday. He recalled that the inverted castle had remained pure white until 7 years ago but had gradually become stained black, and when it had turned completely pitch black, a door had opened. Beyond that door was the god of time and space. Suddenly, the protagonist clicked something and realized aloud that during the fight with Kronos, the god of time and space, he had stolen his rewind skill. Before finishing the sentence, he picked up his phone. He exclaimed that it couldn't be and turned on the device. Just as he suspected, the date was 7 years in the past. The phone displayed the date, September 27, 2024. He looked into the mirror again and confirmed that he had indeed regressed into the past. Immediately, he opened his skill window. As it appeared, he remembered that the rewind skill was gone, but the skill called Skill Drain remained. Seeing this made him very happy. He recalled that for 10 years, he hadn't been able to gain a single skill. But now having this skill, Skill Drain, changed everything. Before he could reflect further, his phone vibrated. He checked the message. It notified him that today was the Mage exam. He realized with recognition. So today was that day. The scene transitioned to Chiyoda Ward in front of Tokyo Station at the Mage Association headquarters. A tall building stood prominently. This was the national agency responsible for managing mages and dungeon conquests. The protagonist entered the building. Surrounded by a crowd, he noted aloud that it still looked new. Then, acknowledging the timeline, he affirmed that it made sense. It was 7 years ago. At that moment, someone called out, "Hey, Colorless, what are you doing here?" The protagonist looked toward the voice. It was his younger brother's party members. The first was Godu, level 36, and the second was Oik, level 37. Seeing them made the protagonist visibly uncomfortable. He thought to himself that these guys were just his brother's lackeys. Godu wrapped an arm around his neck and asked if he was seriously planning to take the Mage exam again. Oik, expressionless, commented that no matter how many times a Colorless tried, it would be pointless. The protagonist recalled. It wasn't the first time he had taken the Mage exam. He remembered that, unable to give up on becoming a mage completely, he had taken the exam again and again, knowing deep down it was likely futile. He had always been a failure. But in the present moment, he pushed Godu's hand off his shoulder and told them to leave him alone. He walked away. Godu complained about his attitude. Oik added, "How dare a mere Colorless ignore them?" Right then, a new character appeared, the exam proctor. She was a beautiful green-haired woman. Her name was Hinata Riene. She was a B-rank mage, level 27. Looking displeased, she remarked, "Again." She sighed and told the protagonist that even if it was just an exam, he might get himself killed someday. The protagonist replied that this time would be different. The scene shifted to the exam setting. They were likely heading into a dungeon. The protagonist stood before a dungeon entrance, stretching in preparation. Hinata asked if he needed an explanation of the details. The protagonist, ready for the challenge, replied that he didn't. He entered the dungeon. He thought to himself that he needed to collect 3 magic stones from goblins to pass the exam. For someone with a skill, this was normally easy. However, his expression darkened. He recalled that today, like in the previous timeline, a monster had appeared in this level 1 dungeon that absolutely shouldn't be there. A terrifying creature revealed itself. The protagonist recognized it. It was Redcap, a goblin with a level of 37. Hinata saw the monster and screamed its name. "Redcap, why is something like that here?" She turned to the protagonist. Running toward him with her sword drawn, she urged him to run. The protagonist knew the level gap was far too great. He remembered how in the previous timeline, Hinata had been unable to defeat it and was overpowered. She had fought only to buy time for his escape, ending up so badly injured that she had to retire from being a mage. He saw the memory clearly, Hinata lying in a hospital bed. He blamed himself for everything. Clenching his fist, he vowed that this time would be different. As Redcap lunged to attack, the protagonist drew his dagger. He threw it toward the monster, thinking that thing had a skill that greatly boosted its physical power. The goblin swatted the dagger aside. He realized that ordinary attacks wouldn't even land. But in the next instant, the protagonist vanished from where he stood and appeared in front of Redcap, landing a punch. He saw minor scratches on his hand after the punch. Redcap, now enraged, charged with a furious expression. Suddenly, the goblin twitched. In front of the protagonist, the system panel appeared. Stole skill, body enhancement extreme. Physical stats have been improved. Power surged through the protagonist. He thought to himself, if he could just steal its skill. And in that very moment, he sliced Redcap cleanly in half with his dagger. After slicing the Redcap goblin, the protagonist remarked that it was nothing more than sliced meat. At that moment, Hinata appeared. Hinata, visibly shocked, exclaimed that the protagonist had defeated a Redcap with just one hit. The protagonist internally acknowledged that the skill drain was working as expected. He admired the power while tightly gripping his dagger, mentally praising his skill drain ability. Hinata then questioned how he had defeated the Redcap. Startled, the protagonist scratched his face and hesitantly thought it would be best not to mention anything about the black skills. He deflected by claiming it was just a coincidence. Hinata, unconvinced, shouted at him to stop lying. She then stated that since an irregular had appeared, the exam would be cancelled. As the protagonist turned toward the red cap's corpse, Hinata mentioned she had to report the incident to headquarters. While picking up a glowing, crystal-like stone, the protagonist reflected that this wasn't the time when irregulars should be appearing yet. Still, he reminded himself that he needed 2 more mana stones. It was revealed that the glowing stones were called mana stones. Hinata, in a panic, warned the protagonist that this wasn't the right time to be worrying about such things. Just then, a monster stepped forward, and the protagonist noticed 2 goblins arriving with weapons in hand. The goblins roared at him but were instantly beheaded. In a single fluid motion, their bodies collapsed, and the protagonist landed gracefully after finishing them off. Hinata watched in awe, shocked by what she had witnessed. Turning to her, the protagonist asked if he could take the mana stones, prompting a bewildered scream from Hinata. The scene shifted to the entrance of the main association headquarters. Hinata handed the protagonist his mage license. He stared at it silently, remembering his past. He recalled how long it had taken to reach this point. He had never given up on his dream of becoming a mage. He had been just a porter for around 10 years. He had been a laughing stock. Now, holding the license card high, he thought to himself that he had finally become a mage. Hinata then handed him a receipt and explained it was for the mana stone exchange. She revealed that mana stones dropped from monsters and served as a valuable energy source with no carbon dioxide emissions. Moreover, they could be sold to the association. Looking at the receipt, the protagonist thought that since he had defeated an A-rank monster, this might be a good source of income. Then he noticed the payment breakdown. He had slain 2 goblins and received 1,000 yen. For the red cap, however, he received 3 million yen. His eyes widened in shock and he shouted out the amount. Hinata reminded him that he had defeated a red cap. Drained and trembling, he muttered to her that mages really did earn a lot of money. He admitted to himself that he hadn't known that. Hinata smiled and told him that he could earn even more. The protagonist then noticed bandages wrapped around Hinata's hand and stared at them. He asked Hinata if he could ask her something. The scene shifted to a dungeon entrance. The protagonist opened his system window and noted that it indeed listed his name. The system confirmed that the dungeon was reserved for him and that it was rank C. He thought to himself that until now he hadn't been able to enter dungeons alone. He now believed he could change the future. He remembered the past version of Hinata where she had retired as a mage and lay in a hospital bed. Now, after his regression, she was smiling. He clenched his fist with a satisfied expression. Suddenly, an attack named Mana hand appeared. A massive hand formed from Mana grabbed the protagonist. At that moment, a voice questioned him, asking what he was doing there. The protagonist looked behind and saw Oik and Godu. Oik sneered, mocking that a colorless mage dared to enter a dungeon solo. Godu laughed, reminding him that it was against the rules. The protagonist calmly stated that he had passed the mage examination and was therefore allowed to enter dungeons solo. Godu's expression darkened and he accused the protagonist of lying. Oik grabbed the protagonist's head, challenging him to show his skills. Looking menacingly at him, Oik demanded proof. The protagonist thought about the skill Mana Hand, which compressed mana into a physical force. However, his extreme body enhancement skill alone wasn't enough to break free. He believed he could still do something. With that, the protagonist headbutted Oik, causing blood to spill from his nose. A system window appeared stating that the skill Mana Hand had been stolen. The active Mana Hand vanished, and both Oik and Godu shouted in disbelief. Mana particles visibly dissipated into the air. The protagonist now used the stolen Mana Hand skill to grab Oik. Shocked, Oik questioned whether the protagonist had really awakened with skills. Godu charged toward him, warning him not to get cocky. Godu conjured and launched a fireball. The protagonist activated his extreme body enhancement and slapped the fireball, dispersing it completely. Godu stood stunned. The protagonist then delivered a powerful punch enhanced with mana, sending Godu flying. Oik watched in disbelief, realizing the protagonist even possessed body enhancement skills. Godu lay on the ground, overwhelmed, and wondered aloud whether the protagonist was dual-colored. Blue and yellow lights radiated from the protagonist. Just then, Godu's shock deepened as he saw the protagonist create a fireball. A system window confirmed that the fireball skill had been stolen. The protagonist fully activated the skill and casually played with fire. Godu shouted in astonishment, realizing there was yet another color. After seeing that the protagonist possessed 3 colors, Godu was shocked and exclaimed that he had never heard of such a thing. At that moment, the protagonist used his newly acquired stolen skill, Fireball, and blasted it toward Godu. Godu panicked, but the fireball didn't hit him. It narrowly missed. Right then, Oik came into view and the mana hand that had been grabbing him began to dissipate. The protagonist warned the 2 of them, asking if they still wanted to fight. They exchanged a glance and then suddenly began running, shouting apologies as they fled. The protagonist sighed, scratched his head, and muttered that if Kai found out, things wouldn't end well. He reflected on how he had been treated like Kai's lapdog before the regression. If Kai discovered he had awakened a skill, he would definitely come to crush him. Kai had already reached the level 50 milestone and was one of the strongest in the modern era. Before the regression, Kai's level had been 89. But Kai wasn't the only one the protagonist needed to be wary of. He knew a certain dungeon would soon be unblocked. He imagined a red dungeon that radiated ominous vibes. But in the present he stood before the entrance of a C-rank dungeon. Gazing at the entrance, he thought that for now he needed to raise his level as much as possible. He entered the dungeon, thinking that level was the foundation of strength. Leveling up allowed him to learn new skills and increase his total mana pool. More importantly, it expanded the amount of mana he could control at once. As he walked down the dungeon hallway, danger loomed. Suddenly, a blast erupted. A new monster appeared, a flame wizard, level 38, wielding a staff and ready to face him. Conjuring a fireball in his hand, the protagonist admitted he could barely manage to create one. At the same moment, the flame wizard conjured many fireballs with ease. Seeing this, the protagonist realized the gap in level created a vast difference in power, even when using the same technique. The flame wizard fired all his fireballs, and the protagonist launched his single fireball to counter the attack. He managed to neutralize one fireball, but two more kept coming. He dodged them by jumping and landing skillfully. He thought that he couldn't win in a head-on fight, but there was a way. He dashed forward, telling himself that no matter how high a monster's level was, one thing never changed. After using a skill, there was always an opening. As he closed the gap between him and the flame wizard, the monster showed slight panic. The protagonist used his extreme body enhancement skill and charged a punch. He thought that there was only a 2-second window, but he made it count, delivering a powerful punch to the flame wizard. The monster took the hit and fell. A system notification appeared, indicating that the fireball skill had been stolen. The flame wizard lay on the ground, and the protagonist realized that its only means of attack was the fireball. If he stole it, the monster wouldn't be scary. The flame wizard got up, ready to attack, but couldn't conjure a fireball. At that moment, the protagonist unleashed the fireball skill he had stolen. A barrage of fireballs engulfed the flame wizard, killing it. A system notification appeared, announcing that the protagonist had leveled up. He looked at the system panel and thought that defeating higher-level opponents yielded a large amount of experience. Though normally difficult, stealing their techniques with skill drain made it easy. He had leveled up from 8 to 12. Clenching his fist, he looked deeper into the dungeon, thinking that he would raise his level to 30. He then defeated many more monsters. First, another flame wizard, and he leveled up. Then a red cap, and he leveled up again. Next, a lizard-type monster, bringing more level gains. After all those battles, he checked his system panel, thinking that he had managed to level up at an incredible speed. His level was now 27. Still, he thought seriously that leveling up was getting harder. To reach level 30, he needed to defeat stronger opponents. The scene shifted to the deepest part of the dungeon, the boss room. The protagonist stood before its massive door. Looking at it, he thought this boss would be the perfect opponent to level up. He pushed the door open and entered the boss room. A silhouette stepped into view, revealing an imp monster at level 30. Then the boss appeared, Skull Demon, level 45. The imps were its minions. The protagonist activated his extreme body enhancement skill, thinking that all of them were higher level. If he could steal their techniques, he had a chance to win. He lunged at the nearest monster and jumped, charging his fist and punching the Skull Demon. A shield appeared, protecting the Skull Demon. The protagonist backed away, shocked, and muttered in frustration. He had suspected it. He still couldn't reach the Skull Demon because the mana barrier was blocking him. Without breaching it, he couldn't activate skill drain to steal its technique. Then the Skull Demon roared and dashed forward, instantly closing the distance. It launched an attack, but the protagonist dodged at the last moment. He thought that to break through the mana barrier, he had no choice but to use that. The protagonist realized that to break through the mana barrier, he would need to deprive the Skull Demon of something valuable. At that moment, he noticed imps flying above, ready to attack. He thought to himself that he didn't have enough power right now. Without hesitation, he lunged toward one of the imps and struck it squarely in the face. In that instant, he activated his skill Drain, and stole the skill Ice Needle. He then conjured a fireball in his hand and launched it at the imp's body, burning it. Right after that, he spotted the second imp and used the stolen Ice Needle skill. The Ice Needle pierced through the imp's chest, killing it instantly. He landed on the ground, now facing the Skull Demon directly. The Skull Demon cast magic, and a magic circle appeared beneath them. From it, another imp was summoned. The protagonist noted to himself that these imps would just keep being resummoned after being killed. Though normally that would be a serious problem, for him right now it was an opportunity. As the newly summoned imp lunged toward him, the protagonist swiftly defeated it. Another imp appeared, and the protagonist slashed it with his dagger. With imps continuing to appear, he quickly gained experience. He leveled up from 27 to 28, thinking that with this rate of experience gain, he could manage it. Looking at the system panel, he thought that if his level kept rising like this, he could do it. Just then, another system notification appeared stating that his controllable mana had reached the specified value. Skill synthesis had been unlocked. The protagonist thought to himself that this was it. The Skull Demon roared in his direction as he summoned Ice Needle in one hand and Fireball in the other. Using his newly unlocked skill synthesis, he began to combine them. A radiant mix of blue and red light formed as the two skills merged. At that moment, he vanished from his place and lunged toward the Skull Demon. We now saw that the synthesized skill had fully formed. He was ready to strike. This new combined skill was called Fire Lance. He used it to attack the Skull Demon, but the demon erected a mana barrier in defense. The Fire Lance collided with the mana barrier, forming visible cracks and eventually shattering it entirely. The protagonist rejoiced, knowing he had broken through the barrier. A system panel then appeared, showing that he had stolen the skill Mana Barrier. Still in midair, the protagonist thought he had to finish it with one more shot. He activated his body enhancement skill and punched the skull demon in the head. Now standing in front of the demon, he observed the demon scratching its skull. The protagonist thought that all enhancements affecting the demon were now gone. He had successfully copied and drained the skill Body Enhancement Extreme from the skull demon. The demon began to twitch, and in that moment the protagonist lunged forward, closing the distance. He used Fire Lance again, piercing the demon. The demon screamed in pain as a green mana stone dropped from its body. The protagonist leveled up. Level up notifications continued, and he eventually reached level 33. He sighed and reflected that skill synthesis, the technique of combining advanced skills, generally became usable around level 30. He sat down in the boss room, thinking that he had managed to do it. He was glad he could use the skill properly. After such a fierce battle, he was clearly exhausted. Right then, another system panel appeared, stating that the level requirement had been met. The number of skills retainable via skill drain had increased. The skill slots had now expanded from 3 to 5. Previously, he could only drain 3 skills from his opponents. But now it had increased to 5, and he thought about how skill drain 2 had now leveled up. This, he considered, would make things much more convenient. The scene then shifted to the Mage headquarters, where the protagonist submitted the green mana stone to the receptionist, Hinata. Hinata was shocked and exclaimed that he had defeated the skull demon. She was astonished to learn he had already reached level 33 in just one day. The protagonist simply shrugged and said he had gotten lucky. Hinata, now suspicious, questioned how he had reached beyond level 30 in a single day. He answered briefly. Hinata continued, saying that at this level one could unconditionally become a B-rank mage. Just then someone stepped into the scene and called out to the protagonist, catching him off guard. It was Kai, who exclaimed that the protagonist must be wrongly ranked as a B-rank mage. The protagonist felt uncomfortable hearing that. Hinata addressed Kai. Kai responded that the protagonist couldn't even use a single skill and was colorless. He scoffed at the idea of the protagonist being a B-rank mage. Hinata then defended the protagonist, saying he had defeated both the Red Cap and the Skull Diva. Kai turned toward the protagonist with a look of disgust. He activated his power and asked if the protagonist had really done it. He then charged a punch glowing with purple energy toward him. A gust of wind swept the area as Kai's punch flew. The protagonist blocked it with his mana barrier and remarked that it was honestly dangerous. The moment Kai's fierce punch was stopped, it was clear that something had changed. Hinata called out to Kai while the protagonist held Kai's hand firmly. Kai, staring in disbelief, remarked that the protagonist had awakened with skills. He added that the rumors were true. The protagonist responded affirmatively. Just then, Kai snapped his hand away and warned the protagonist not to get too excited just because he could use a few skills. With a menacing glare, Kai challenged the protagonist, declaring that he would see for himself just how capable he really was. Hinata, concerned, questioned Kai about his intentions to fight. Kai looked away dismissively and muttered that if the protagonist were a true B-rank mage, he wouldn't even have flinched. Hinata hesitated, observing the tension building. Kai then smirked mockingly and suggested that perhaps the protagonist's rank had been a lie all along. The protagonist clenched his fist, thinking that refusing Kai's challenge would only bring him trouble later. Determination flared in the protagonist's eyes as he accepted the challenge with a firm understood. Kai was visibly displeased by the response, silently cursing the protagonist. The scene shifted to the arena within the Mage Association headquarters. There, Kai and the protagonist stood facing each other. As he eyed his opponent, the protagonist reminded himself to stay cautious, especially when fighting someone with greater mana control. He thought he mustn't drop his guard no matter what. Visualizing the combat ahead, the protagonist calculated that at his level 30 he could chain together 3 basic skills, while Kai at level 50 could likely manage 5. He realized that on that basis alone, a direct confrontation would mean his loss, so he had to find a way to close the gap. Just then, the protagonist activated his ice needles and launched an attack at Kai. Kai countered by summoning multiple fireballs and sending them toward the protagonist. As the two attacks collided, a powerful impact shook the area. Smoke billowed in front of Kai from the explosion. As the smoke cleared, Kai was stunned to find that the protagonist had closed the distance. The protagonist had used his extreme body enhancement skill. Observing the yellow-colored aura, Kai realized the protagonist was a dual-color wielder. The protagonist deduced that after Kai's 4th skill, he must have only enough mana left for one more. At that moment, the protagonist activated his skill synthesis. He summoned a fire lance, thinking that combining red and blue would create something new. Kai, also observing, noted the same and questioned whether the protagonist could use 3 colors of skills. Then, smiling darkly, Kai summoned a massive fireball to counter the fire lance. The attack sent the protagonist flying. Shocked, the protagonist thought his synthesized fire lance, which cost the power of 2 skills, was neutralized so easily. Kai smirked and acknowledged the protagonist's 3-color skill usage but warned that he was on another level. He then activated another skill and told the protagonist to dance, sending a barrage of fireballs. The protagonist began running and dodging the onslaught. In return, the protagonist launched another fire lance toward Kai. Kai, now more excited, summoned a fireball to pierce the fire lance. The The fireball shattered the fire lance and continued its trajectory toward the protagonist. At the last moment, the protagonist used his mana barrier. Cracks formed on the barrier and it eventually shattered, sending him flying again from the blast. Kai, pleased with himself, smiled as the protagonist lay down. He then pointed at the protagonist, commanding him to bow his head in apology, claiming he'd forgive him if he did. The protagonist, lips clenched, thought about his inability to win with his current power. He considered giving up but questioned if he would continue living like a slave just as in his previous life. Stepping up, he declared to himself that he wouldn't submit. A new resolve sparked in his eyes. Kai noted this change and darkly commented that the protagonist wouldn't learn until he was dead. Kai's expression grew grim. He declared he had no choice and summoned an unusual fireball. Purple engravings appeared behind him and the system notified that overclock had been activated. This skill allowed the user to temporarily double their mana control by consuming a large amount of mana. The protagonist was stunned. Kai summoned multiple fireballs, announcing it as the power of a king. He began juggling them with ease, declaring it a 10-combo attack. The protagonist watched, realizing that this was Kai's true strength. He imagined how Kai could temporarily surpass other kings in mana control. Despite the overwhelming energy, the protagonist shouted that he had been waiting for Kai to use that very skill. He sprinted toward Kai, thinking that only Kai could perform 10 consecutive attacks using overclock. Leaping into the air, he felt fully resolved. Kai laughed and mocked the idea of dodging in midair. Then, he launched all 10 fireballs at once. In response, the protagonist activated Mana Hand. A giant hand formed from mana that gripped the ground behind Kai. While still airborne, the protagonist used Mana Hand to swing around. Kai realized too late that the protagonist had a new skill. The protagonist dodged all 10 fireballs in midair and noted that cooldown still applied even for a king. Landing behind Kai, he quickly spun and concluded that in this brief cooldown Kai would be defenseless. He punched Kai brutally in the face, sending him flying with blood splattering. Standing tall, the protagonist watched as a golden system panel announced that the skill overclock had been stolen. He looked at his hand, thinking that Kai was finished. Kai struggled to rise, cursing the protagonist. The protagonist wondered if Kai still intended to fight. Kai's face now wore the twisted expression of a killer as he declared his intent to kill. A crystal wrapped in purple energy formed above his hand, identified as Demon Lance. Kai announced the attack. The protagonist recognized it as the strongest purple skill. He was astonished that Kai had mastered it by level 50. Kai launched the Demon Lance and the protagonist barely dodged. He noted that several shards appeared above Kai, preparing for another barrage. Kai looked terrifying as he continued the attack. The protagonist reflected that he had landed a hit only because Kai had been careless. But he knew once Kai got serious, the gap in strength would become overwhelming. Dodging rapidly, the protagonist soon found himself at a dead end. Kai grinned menacingly and warned that he wasn't finished yet. Both prepared to attack Kai with Demon Lance, the protagonist with Fire Lance. The attacks clashed, but Kai-S was stronger, slamming the protagonist into a wall. A hole formed from the impact as the protagonist struggled to rise, lifting his right hand. Kai announced that this was why he was called the Purple King and the proof of his strength. Exhausted, the protagonist admitted to himself that Kai's power was truly formidable. Kai continued boasting, warning the protagonist not to be arrogant just because he could use multiple skills. But something clicked in the protagonist's mind. Looking at his hand, he made a fist, wondering if he could unlock the potential of purple mana too. He reflected that he had been limited to synthesizing 2 colors because of his mana capacity. But now, with overclock in his arsenal, that had changed. Purple engravings appeared behind him, identical to Kai-S. Kai was shocked and questioned how the protagonist could also use overclock. The protagonist realized that his mana capacity had indeed doubled. A system panel confirmed the increase due to overclock. Then another panel appeared, unlocking skill synthesis, black. The protagonist, feeling confident, thought this was the moment. Kai, watching, wondered what he was planning. The protagonist examined his hand, thinking this was a 3-color synthesis never seen before. He activated his red skill first. Then he added his blue skill, mixing the two. Finally, he activated his yellow skill, combining it with the red and blue. The skill began to shift in color, turning into a dark shade in his hand. Kai was stunned and gasped, black mana. The protagonist recalled being told he wasn't suited for any of the 3 colors, but he now knew that was false. He had already absorbed those manas. Declaring himself a dark mage, he stood menacingly before Kai. Kai, panicking, pointed his magic at the protagonist, warning him to stay away. A Demon Lance attack was launched at full speed toward the protagonist, who calmly observed the incoming strike and repelled it using his black flames. After countering Kai's attack, Kai, in disbelief, exclaimed that it was impossible. Through the smoke, the protagonist charged toward Kai, gathering another black flame in his hand. At the same time, Kai readied his Demon Lance and cursed the protagonist. As both were prepared to strike with their respective magics, the protagonist, looking menacingly at Kai, shouted that this was his Abyss Flame. The 2 attacks collided, but the Demon Lance's crystal shattered, horrifying Kai. The Abyss Flame then struck Kai, defeating him. Amidst the mist, the protagonist emerged and sighed in relief, realizing he had defeated Kai. Kai was seen lying unconscious on the ground. At that moment, the protagonist dropped to his knees and became invisible, whispering that he did it. A system panel then appeared, notifying that the skill Abyss Flame had been acquired through the synthesis of Synthesis Black. The protagonist recalled his Abyss Flame skill just as Hinata entered the room, asking with concern if he was okay. The protagonist smiled and replied that he had somehow defeated Kai. Hinata then questioned what the skill was. The protagonist reflected inwardly, realizing he couldn't hide it any longer. A black magic gathered in his hand and enveloped his entire body. In response to Hinata, he stated that it seemed to be a black skill. Hinata, stunned by the black magic, remarked that it was the world's first. The protagonist questioned whether he was obligated to report it to the association and expressed a desire to keep the power a secret. Hinata hesitated, clarifying that she never meant to expose him but felt he might be missing an opportunity. The protagonist asked what opportunity she meant. Hinata explained that the strongest mage of each color received the title of king, and since he was the only black mage in the world, he could be considered the Black King. The protagonist pondered the title, thinking it sounded interesting, but told Hinata that he wasn't interested for the time being. Inwardly, he thought that even becoming a king didn't mean his level had risen drastically. Looking over at the unconscious Kai, the protagonist asked Hinata if he was okay. Hinata replied that Kai was one of the kings and would recover soon despite the severity of his wounds. She then pulled out her phone and mentioned she would take Kai to the medical room. At that moment, both Hinata's and the protagonist's phones began to alarm. The protagonist checked his phone, surprised to see a warning. A dungeon had appeared at the west entrance of Ikebukuro Park. The recommended level was 70. Hinata, upon seeing the alert, was left speechless, while the protagonist thought to himself that it had finally begun, the Ikebukuro dungeon. Although the recommended level was 70, most of the kings were only around level 50. Within a week, the kings would realize their powerlessness, leading to the dungeon being left abandoned. It marked the beginning of a tragedy, a dungeon collapse. At the current moment, this event remained unknown. If a dungeon wasn't conquered within a set time, monsters would escape the gate and kill everyone nearby. The Ikebukuro dungeon eventually became the first dungeon outbreak in history. Tokyo was overrun by monsters, resulting in countless deaths. Determination flashed across the protagonist's face as he vowed to prevent the tragedy from happening again. He resolved to stop the dungeon collapse at any cost. Aloud, he declared that he would conquer that dungeon. Hinata, shocked, protested, saying that even for him it was too dangerous. She recalled that only mages ranked A and above were allowed into dungeons with a recommended level above 50. The protagonist, sweating slightly, thought that fortunately, there was still time before the dungeon collapse began. He noted that the next A-rank examination was in about a week. Upon confirming this with Hinata, who answered affirmatively, he clenched his fist and declared that he would rise to A-rank at the next examination. The protagonist had made up his mind to conquer the A-rank examination. Upon hearing this, Hinata was taken aback and reacted in disbelief, exclaiming about the A-rank promotion. Hinata added that with the protagonist's skills, he might even succeed in the exam. The protagonist was visibly shocked by this statement and questioned Hinata if there was any problem. Hinata, recalling the prerequisites, explained that in order to take the A-rank promotion exam, one must first clear a B-rank dungeon with a party. In other words, he needed to form a party within a week and clear a B-rank dungeon. Moments later, after hearing Hinata's condition about clearing a dungeon with a party, the protagonist appeared disheartened. He was seen sitting on the sofa, looking dejected while others cast questioning glances at him. Pulling out his phone, he lamented that he had completely forgotten about this requirement. Messages on his phone revealed people mocking him, one saying, "Who would party up with a colorless?" and another suggesting sarcastically, "Go leech your brother instead, lol." The protagonist thought to himself that the news of his being colorless had already spread, but he still needed to clear an unexplored B-rank dungeon within a week. He admitted it would be difficult to accomplish this task with only a mage. Frustrated and unsure of what to do, he scratched his head in contemplation. At that moment, a commotion behind him caught his attention. A group of 3 women were arguing, and the group leader was asserting that she would make someone work today no matter what. Observing the situation, the protagonist wondered what was going on. The woman in the middle, wearing an annoyed expression, addressed someone, stating that she had only allowed them to join the party because she had heard they were a dual-color wielder. However, she criticized that their fire skill was too weak. A girl with purple hair apologized to her, revealing herself to be the subject of the criticism. The protagonist stood from his seat, thinking that he had stumbled upon something he would rather have avoided, as he himself was often treated like a burden. The woman continued to berate the purple-haired girl, declaring that she was just being honest and that Ikenos was indeed a dead weight. It was at this point that the protagonist learned the girl's name, Ikenos Aya. Upon hearing her name, the protagonist pondered whether she was truly Ikenos Aya, the same individual who would later be known as the Scarlet King. At this point in time, however, she still carried an image of incompetence. Nonetheless, the protagonist was surprised to witness her being treated so poorly by her own party. The scene shifted to Ikenos, who, rubbing her hands together, hesitantly told the scolding woman that if she were kicked out of the party, she would no longer be able to cover her sister's medical expenses. Pleading she promised to do better next time, the woman scoffed and challenged her to prove herself in the day's raid or risk being expelled. Ikenos responded with determination, saying she would do her best. The group of women then left the association. The protagonist, watching them go, wondered whether they would be all right. As evening set in and the sky turned orange with the sunset, the protagonist walked the streets in deep thought. He reflected that Ikenos would eventually become the Scarlet King, but before reaching that point she would endure many hardships. If memory served him right, a critical incident was supposed to happen around this time. He recalled that during a boss battle, she had been gravely injured and had fallen into a coma for several years. Suddenly, he was struck by a realization. Perhaps that incident was going to occur today. Though not completely certain, he sensed that something was off about her and concluded with a worried expression that he needed to hurry to save her. The scene transitioned to a dungeon where the boss room gate was opening and the group of women had arrived to face the boss. The boss, identified as Dullahan, stabbed his heavy sword into the ground, causing destruction. He was a level 45 entity, headless, with flames in place of a head and donned in heavy armor. At that moment, the leader of the group claimed she had an idea and with a scoff and a sinister laugh abruptly pushed Ikenos forward. Ikenos, shocked by the push, heard the leader instruct her to fight the boss alone. Horrified, Ikenos protested that she couldn't possibly defeat Dullahan on her own. The woman retorted that failure would mean expulsion, prompting Ikenos to plead desperately not to be abandoned. The woman mockingly told her to do her best, reminding her that this was all for her little sister, further mocking her. With no other choice and a sorrowful expression, Ikenos turned toward the boss, resolving to follow the order. Despite her resolve, she was visibly trembling in fear while the other women laughed at her expense. Ikenos gathered magic in her hands and launched a fireball at the boss, engulfing it in flames. However, the boss remained unharmed, standing as though the flames had barely affected him. Seeing this, she realized her attack had failed. Suddenly, the boss stomped the ground and leapt high into the air, sword poised for attack. In the next instant, he came crashing down with his sword aimed at Ikenos, who narrowly dodged the strike. Despite avoiding the blow, the sheer force sent her flying. Now lying on the ground and aching with pain, Ikenos looked up to see the imposing shadow of the boss looming over her. The boss raised his large sword, preparing to finish her off. Internally, Ikenos accepted her fate, thinking she was truly useless, and closed her eyes, bracing for the end. But at that critical moment, the protagonist appeared, shouting extreme body enhancement as he activated his skill. He positioned himself in front of Ikenos with his sword, blocking the boss's attack. Ikenos, shocked, looked up to see the protagonist standing in front of her. With determination in his eyes, he used his skill to push the boss back, sending the creature flying and crashing into the ground. Ikenos, still dazed and stunned, stared at the protagonist's back. He turned to her and asked gently if she was all right. At that moment, the leader of the women's party eyed the protagonist and questioned internally who he could possibly be. She subconsciously considered that Dullahan, being the kind of monster he was, should have been heavy and formidable. Yet somehow this man had blown him away with a single sword strike. She silently asked herself again, "What is he?" While she remained trapped in her thoughts, Dullahan, the monstrous boss who had previously been launched by the protagonist's attack, let out a deafening battle roar. The shockwave from the sound rippled through the battlefield and reached the protagonist. Observing Dullahan rising, the protagonist thought, as expected, that his earlier sword strike wasn't enough. He quickly noted that Dullahan's armor had been enhanced with a strengthening skill, making it impervious to normal attacks. In response, the protagonist dashed forward, ready to throw hands. Dullahan, not one to back down, charged as well, swinging his sword. The protagonist agilely dodged, leaping above the trajectory of the incoming strike. As he soared, he plotted to steal Dullahan's skill and nullify it. After dodging, he reached out and used his magic skill Drain by making contact with Dullahan's armor. But to his shock, the skill totally flopped. In that vulnerable moment, Dullahan clapped him with a strike, sending him flying backwards. Ikenos, clearly worried, called out, asking if he was okay. The protagonist assured her that he had somehow managed to block the attack with his sword, though internally he frowned, realizing the flaw. He deduced that Dullahan's armor was only external. To activate Drain, he would have to touch Dullahan's actual body, but Dullahan was relentless. He raised his sword high and smashed it into the ground. The earth shattered beneath him, and an attack surging with green energy zoomed toward the protagonist. Cautiously, the protagonist told Ikenos to stay behind him as he activated his magic. "Magic barrier," he declared, shielding both himself and Ikenos from the devastating blast. However, the impact of the attack spread out beyond the barrier's radius. Two members of the women's party got yeeted across the field, while the leader shielded herself as best as she could. Enraged by the attack, the leader of the women's party activated her magic in retaliation, launching an ice needle at Dullahan while furiously calling him a bastard. Dullahan responded by raising his sword and smashing the ground again, blocking and shattering the incoming ice needle. The woman was left in shock. Not only had her crystal conjuration been obliterated, but the force of the counterattack had blasted her away. As she flew back, the protagonist watched her, noting that even the ice needle magic was totally useless against Dullahan. Accepting this L, the sword in his hand vanished. He concluded he needed a skill stronger than Dullahan's beefed-up armor to break through. He began combining his red, yellow, and blue magic, forming dark flames. He reaffirmed his thought. He needed a skill that went beyond Dullahan's defense, something cracked. As the combination stabilized, he announced the resulting skill, Black Mana. Seeing this, Ikenos was visibly shook. With the Black Mana now active, the protagonist unleashed his next move, Abyss Flames. Meanwhile, Dullahan was charging up another attack. He pulled back his sword and struck the ground again. His energy-charged assault surged forward. The protagonist didn't move, he just stood there Loki vibing, waiting for the perfect moment. Then at the last second, he countered it with Abyss Flames. The two forces collided and the Abyss Flames straight up nuked Dullahan's attack. With the path cleared, the Abyss Flames continued at breakneck speed, heading straight toward Dullahan. Within seconds, the black fire clapped Dullahan, wrapping him in a raging inferno. Dullahan twitched violently and then an explosive burst of power erupted from within. The monster started vanishing amidst the blaze, his form breaking apart. All that remained was his glowing green mana stone. Ikenos, absolutely speechless, pointed out that it only took one hit to obliterate Dullahan. She praised the protagonist, calling him amazing. Shortly after, she called out to him, prompting him to turn. She thanked him sincerely for saving her. The protagonist responded with chill energy, saying he was just glad she was okay. Then, without hesitation, he picked up the mana stone that had dropped from Dullahan. As he examined it, he thought it matched exactly what he had read. He silently expressed relief that he had saved Ikenos today, wondering what kind of nightmare she might have faced otherwise. Just then, the leader of the women's party stood up while coughing, clearly dazed and confused. She began biting her thumbnail, processing the chaos. Internally, she realized that the protagonist wasn't just some random dude, but almost instantly her expression flipped into a devilish grin. She decided that the reward for defeating the boss was gonna be hers. Her face twisted into a grotesque and greedy smirk. She suddenly shouted, demanding their attention. Addressing the protagonist and Ikenos, she shamelessly declared that the reward drop was from a dungeon her squad had been gunning for. She told them to hand over the mana stone. Ikenos was stunned at the audacity and clapped back, saying the protagonist literally saved them. But the protagonist, cool as ever, said he didn't mind giving up the stone on one condition: Ikenos would join his party. Ikenos was taken aback, staring at him in disbelief. Even the women's party leader was like, "What?" The protagonist clarified that this was only if Ikenos was down for it. Ikenos, still reeling, tried to process the offer. Then the women's party leader suddenly grinned and started cackling. Her two party members joined her like it was a roast session. She said she had been curious what he'd say and then agreed to his terms. With a wide grin, she approached Ikenos and placed a hand on her shoulder, asking if she was cool with it. Ikenos clenched her fists, realizing how real this was. Looking at the protagonist, she said she understood and would be in his care. Just then, the leader of the women's party snatched the mana stone from the protagonist's hand. As she walked away, she started singing "Money, Money" and mocked Ikenos, saying she never thought a so-called deadweight could sell for this high. The protagonist, hearing the insult, lingered on the word deadweight. He mulled it over, thinking to himself that she had no idea what Ikenos was truly capable of. Meanwhile, Ikenos approached him and humbly thanked him for the invite. The protagonist apologized for making her dip from her party so suddenly and asked if she was truly okay with it. Ikenos replied, saying she had just been a burden. But the protagonist hit her with a soft, "It's okay." Her eyes widened and he added, "It's okay, you're gonna glow up and get stronger." The man had no doubt she was only just getting started. Ikenos stood in awe, stunned by the protagonist's belief that she could become stronger. Her voice trembled but held a spark of hope as she declared that she would become stronger. Confused, she asked if he truly believed that. The protagonist just nodded, calm and steady, and mentioned that before he came here, he had seen her at the association. He added that he had overheard her conversation there. It wasn't intentional, just a coincidence. Ikenos' expression darkened slightly as she remembered that moment. But before she could spiral, the protagonist stepped in again, saying he thought he could be her support. He extended his hand toward her, the gesture screaming, "You can rely on me." Ikenos hesitated, lost in thought, then gave a small but determined nod. With newfound resolve in her voice, she said she'd be in his care. That simple answer made the protagonist's face light up. He responded with a cheerful, "Yes, same here," and they sealed the moment with a handshake. The next day, the scene cut to Ikenos and the protagonist standing before a dungeon. With a confident grin, the protagonist announced their next goal, conquering a B-rank dungeon. Ikenos turned to him and asked if clearing this dungeon would qualify them for the A-rank examination. He confirmed, saying she was right, but also added that within this dungeon was a key, one that could make her stronger. Ikenos blinked, repeating the word key in surprise. Inside, her thoughts spiraled toward a different motivation. Once she got stronger and leveled up, she could finally earn enough to pay off the medical bills. The protagonist broke her train of thought, calling her name and signaling it was go time. Ikenos nodded firmly and both of them wore game faces as they entered the dungeon. The inside of the crystal cave was breathtaking, glowing with blue crystals scattered across its walls. Almost immediately, Ikenos noticed something up ahead and pointed it out. A horde of wolves, each marked with red streaks, stood in their path. The protagonist's face hardened with recognition. These were black wolves. Without missing a beat, he told Ikenos to leave them to him. She agreed. Then he activated his extreme body enhancement skill and launched himself forward like a literal bullet. With one clean strike, he took down a wolf and then zipped past the rest, each slash landing with deadly precision. Watching him, Ikenos' jaw nearly hit the floor. Her thoughts drifted to her previous party led by Isayama-san. They were strong, but this was different. This was insane. This was cracked. The protagonist wiped sweat from his brow after cleaning up the wolves. As they continued deeper into the dungeon, he told her they'd arrived at the crucial point. This was where he'd support her, time to stick to the plan. Ikenos acknowledged him, walking forward determined. She thought to herself that defeating more monsters was the fastest way to level up. Sure, she only had basic attack skills, but that wouldn't stop her. Suddenly, small creatures lunged at her. She braced herself, thinking, I have to try. Summoning her fireball spell, she conjured it with intense focus and launched it straight at the approaching enemies. From behind, the protagonist observed. This was her trial. Would she recognize her true weapon? But he didn't have time to keep watch. A presence stirred behind him, and as he turned, he muttered, You're here, I won't let you disturb Ikenos. A squad of monsters had appeared behind him. Meanwhile, Ikenos was caught off guard. A sneaky little monster jumped her, leaving her wounded. Clutching her arm, she gritted her teeth. No matter how many she defeated, more just kept coming. She was running low on mana. Her body screamed exhaustion. Her mind echoed with doubt. But then she caught sight of the protagonist still fighting like a beast, pouring everything he had into the battle. She realized he was trying to ease her fight. Fueled by that thought, she stood back up, fireball spell conjuring in her palm once more. She told herself to stop whining. She had to level up. She had to live up to what he believed in. Fire erupted. She unleashed spell after spell, her fireballs slamming into monsters around her. Level up notifications started popping up like crazy, and she was stunned. Her mana wasn't depleting despite the barrage. The protagonist watched with a small smirk. As expected, Ikenos was built different. Her ability to drag out fights, her endless mana pool, that was her real weapon. And suddenly, a system panel popped up next to her. Her eyes widened in shock. A new skill had just been unlocked, Blast Furnace. The scene jumped to the boss room. At its center stood a massive creature, huge slime, level 52. The protagonist charged at it, shouting to Ikenos mid-run to use her newly unlocked skill. She nodded, responding with an enthusiastic okay. For the first time, she activated Blast Furnace. Instantly, flames engulfed her entire body. Her eyes widened in amazement. This was her power. She clenched her fist, determined. Now it was her turn. From the sidelines, the protagonist analyzed the skill. Blast Furnace ramped up the firepower of her attacks at the cost of high mana. It was practically tailor-made for Ikenos. She stood in flames, eyes glowing red, and then boom, a barrage of fire rained down. The protagonist watched, mouth slightly open, thinking it was even more than he expected. Her mana plus Blast Furnace absolutely broken. With this firepower, she could become the Scarlet King. And just like that, her fire incinerated the huge slime boss in seconds. After the battle, the protagonist congratulated her with a proud good job. Ikenos smiled back, a bit surprised herself, and with a light laugh admitted that this was all thanks to him. Behind them, the fiery aftermath of her attack had left a massive crater where the boss used to be. The scene transitioned again. Ikenos and the protagonist were now walking out of the association. Ikenos looked up and said they'd fulfilled the condition for the A-rank examination. The protagonist confirmed it. Inside, his thoughts were burning with anticipation. Finally, it was time for the promotion test. He'd pass no matter what. The scene shifted to the day of the A-rank promotion exam at the Mage Association HQ, and the area was packed with participants. Hinata stood in front of the crowd and announced that the first phase would evaluate their combat capabilities, and then pair them with someone for a mock battle. Among the crowd stood our boy and Ichinose. The protagonist wore a slightly ambitious expression, thinking to himself that the promotion exam had finally arrived. He reminded himself that he had to pass and become an A-rank mage, no excuses. As the scene transitioned, the protagonist and Ichinose were seen walking and chatting. He commented to her that the real exam was right in front of them. Ichinose, visibly hyped, responded with a cheerful, "Let's do our best." The protagonist then explained that the first test would be on their combat abilities. But before they could continue their chat, someone suddenly interrupted. "Oh my, I never expected an incompetent like you to be participating in the exam," came a snide voice. Ichinose flinched, visibly startled. The speaker turned out to be none other than Isayama, who approached with a mocking laugh. Ichinose hesitated, clearly uncomfortable responding. The protagonist quietly observed, then stepped forward, standing tall in front of Ichinose like a literal wall. He shielded her and threw shade at Isayama, saying she wouldn't lose to people who left others to fight solo. He didn't stop there. He straight-up roasted Isayama for ditching Ichinose during the Dullahan boss battle. That jab didn't sit right with Isayama. She scoffed, telling him to feel free to act tough, and added that she now had better party members anyway. While the banter heated up, someone else walked up from behind. It was a new addition to Isayama's party, a woman introduced as Yuri. Isayama smirked and flexed that this new teammate was someone neither the protagonist nor Ichinose could ever beat. The moment the name Yuri dropped, the protagonist blinked, taken aback. He recalled hearing that name in his past life. There was that time she solo cleared a high-difficulty dungeon just for kicks, and boom, she got insta-famous. He remembered that around this time, Yuri's ability was probably already on par with an A-rank mage. As he processed all this, Yuri suddenly stepped right up to his face, completely catching him off guard. Looking him dead in the eyes with a mischievous smile, Yuri said, "Young man, you look like an interesting person." The protagonist was still low-key stunned by the sudden interaction, his thoughts in a total spaghetti mode. From behind, Ichinose chimed in, asking if there was something weird about him. She called out his name and that caught Yuri's attention. She paused, thinking aloud. "Ah, perhaps he is. Kurosaki Rei," she said. She then connected the dots. "Brother of Kurosaki Kai, the Purple King, I heard Kurosaki Kai got clapped by someone," she said, pointing straight at the protagonist. "That was you, right?" The protagonist, still internally spiraling, thought, "She knows that much about me." Ichinose, meanwhile, was losing her mind in full-on panic mode. She turned to him and shrieked, asking if it was actually true that he defeated Kurosaki Kai. But Yuri just turned around with a casual toss of her words, saying, "Well, you can't win against me." As she walked away, she casually added that there was a rumor floating around about the Purple King, but in her opinion, he wasn't even comparable to her. The protagonist simply smiled a little. The scene then cut to the training grounds of the Mage Association HQ. A man, likely one of the examiners, stood ready and announced that their combat skills would now be tested using an artificial golem. Behind him stood a massive mechanical golem. The examiner explained that it was covered in a special type of rock, tougher than regular stone, and instructed them to do their best to attack it. Then he called the protagonist's name, telling him to step forward. Among the participants, the protagonist came forward. As the golem powered up into battle mode, the protagonist readied his red magic, locking eyes with the mechanical beast. One of the participants scoffed, questioning why the protagonist was using fire element magic against a metal element golem. Another chimed in, calling him stupid. The battle kicked off. Both the golem and the protagonist charged at each other. While dashing, the protagonist inwardly acknowledged that normal fire wouldn't break this thing. The golem went in for an attack, but the protagonist dodged like a pro. In his other hand, he began channeling blue magic. Red and blue magic swirled together in his hand, a dual casting flex. In the next second, he let it rip with a fire lance attack, smashing straight into the golem's head. A massive hole formed where the attack landed. The golem stuttered, smoke started billowing, and with a mechanical groan, it collapsed to the ground with a thud. The examiner confirmed that the golem had been destroyed. The two guys who had been trash-talking earlier stood there stunned. One mumbled, "He destroyed it with a single hit." "It was dual-color magic, right?" the other added. Among the participants, Yuri tilted her head with a sly grin and commented, "He fused fire with blue mana to amp up its firepower. Not bad." The protagonist stood there, quietly watching the smoldering remains of the golem he had just wrecked. The next test up was Ichinose's, an assessment of her mana pool. In front of her stood the examiner, a sleek device placed between them. A glowing crystal orb shimmered in the middle of the apparatus. The examiner instructed her calmly, telling Ichinose to place her hand on the orb to begin the measurement. As Ichinose hesitated, the camera panned to the crowd, where Isayama stood, muttering under her breath that Ichinose should be ashamed of herself. Ichinose slowly raised her hand, hesitating for a second before placing it on the orb. The moment her hand made contact, a sudden ignition flared around her. Flames erupted as if from nowhere, engulfing her entire form in an explosive burst of fire. The whole crowd was shook. Jaws hit the floor, including Isayama's. In pure disbelief, Isayama just stood there, lips twitching, biting her nails. Whispers rippled through the crowd, "Amazing, who is she?" But Isayama wasn't having it. With bitter eyes, she hissed that Ichinose must be cheating. The scene cut to the final test, mock battles. The examiner announced the start of the matches, and the very first face-off was none other than Ichinose versus Isayama. Both stepped up to the podium, tension thick in the air. Ichinose looked visibly stressed, letting out a sigh. Meanwhile, Isayama stood tall, with that usual smug arrogance plastered on her face. Her thoughts. She was about to strip the truth right off Ichinose, like peeling layers off a fake bitch. As the examiner signaled the start of the match, Isayama wasted zero time. She launched her first move immediately, Ice Needle. A flurry of sharp, icy spikes flew toward Ichinose. Ichinose responded instinctively, calling out her counter, Fireball. A massive orb of fire materialized in her hand, and she hurled it straight into the oncoming needles. The moment of impact was dramatic. Her fireball obliterated the ice like it was nothing. Isayama had to shield her face from the blast, barely keeping her composure. Under her breath, she admitted she didn't expect this. She was rattled. Ichinose's firepower was way more than she bargained for. As she stood confused, Ichinose was already prepping another fireball, calmly calling out the spell again. Watching the next fireball charge up, Isayama panicked, straight up terrified. And then came the real storm. Ichinose unleashed a barrage of fireballs, each aimed right at her. Isayama, scrambling, screamed not to underestimate her. She threw up a mana barrier just in time to block the incoming attacks. The shield held barely. Internally, she scoffed, calling Ichinose an idiot. Her plan: let the girl finish her flashy attack and then strike back. But that plan flopped. The fireballs just kept coming, relentless. The longer it lasted, the more Isayama sweated. Something wasn't adding up. Why weren't the attacks stopping? Ichinose stood locked in laser-focused, blasting away, and that's when our protagonist, watching from the sidelines, had a flashback. He recalled how Ichinose had an insane mana pool. If she kept attacking non-stop, no barrier would ever hold. Just like that, the prediction proved true, the barrier shattered under the relentless pressure. Isayama straight up panicked and bolted, running for her life. Fireballs pounded the ground around her, sending debris flying. One of the rocks clocked her right on the head. She collapsed, totally KO'd. As she faded into unconsciousness, her last thoughts spiraled. This can't be real. This has to be a lie. Then the examiner raised their voice, declaring enough. The match was over. The winner, Ichinose. Ichinose lit up, smiling ear to ear. Our protagonist nodded, giving props. She did good. It was a dope battle. Ichinose, still a little in disbelief, said it felt too good to be true. Before stepping away, she turned to the protagonist and wished him good luck for his upcoming match. And right at that moment, Yuri stepped forward. As their eyes locked, the protagonist simply muttered, "Yeah." The next face-off was about to begin, and the examiner officially announced the battle. The moment locked in, the protagonist and Yuri stood face to face, tension buzzing in the air. Inside her head, Yuri reflected with sharp focus, thinking that her opponent in this final mock battle turned out to be him. She mused that this would be interesting. At that same moment, the protagonist's eyes locked right onto her, their gazes colliding. Breaking the silence, Yuri pointed straight at him and said aloud that he should have a reason for taking this examination right. She pressed the question, tilting her head, but the protagonist refused to answer. Unbothered, Yuri continued, saying it felt like he was more prepared than the other participants, and she wondered why. The protagonist finally replied, his tone sharp and firm, that he had something he needed to do no matter what. His expression turned fierce, and in his mind he reflected inwardly, that's why he couldn't stop here. Yuri caught that look and instantly flared up her aura, mana gathering in her hand. She declared boldly that she was strong. The protagonist braced with his sword, smirking as he answered that he knew, but he would win anyway. That made Yuri light up with intrigue. She admitted he was interesting just as the examiner announced the official start of the mock battle. The second the fight began, Yuri conjured multiple mana swords and hurled them all at once toward the protagonist. Calm but fierce, he parried every incoming blade with his own sword. As he countered, his thoughts sharpened. This was mana conversion, a rare skill allowing free manipulation of mana. Suddenly, he caught something in his peripheral vision, a massive projectile dropping down from above. His instincts screamed and he dodged just in time. Yuri smirked and mocked him, praising his dodge but already plotting her next move. The protagonist dashed straight at her, thinking it was his turn now, but Yuri wasn't caught off guard. She snapped that she wouldn't let him get close so easily, unleashing another storm of projectiles. The protagonist, unfazed, deployed his mana barrier, blocking them all as he pushed forward in an instant, closing the gap. He slashed, but Yuri flipped upward into the air. While she was midair, the protagonist activated his blue skill and red skill, chaining them into a fire lance attack. The blazing lance shot straight at her. Yuri's eyes narrowed. She instantly conjured a mana shield with her conversion, blocking the lance before landing gracefully on the ground. She admitted to him that was close. The protagonist noted grimly that her defense was flawless. She was strong, exactly as he expected. Meanwhile, Ikanos in the audience watched with worry, biting her lip for the protagonist. Back in the arena, Yuri's lips curled into a mischievous smile as she deployed her next barrage. Dozens of mana projectiles swarmed from every direction, hemming the protagonist in. He twisted and dodged them all, flipping backwards, but gritted his teeth, muttering that this was seriously troublesome. Yuri wasn't done. She taunted if he really thought he could win just by running around, then unleashed even more projectiles, calling out checkmate. The protagonist was trapped, projectiles closing in mere inches away. At the last moment, he activated his extreme body enhancement. His body blurred with super speed, tearing through every projectile until the battlefield lit up in his fierce blue aura. The sight shocked Yuri completely. She gasped, exclaiming body enhancement, before admitting with awe that he could actually use that ability. The two faced each other again, the tension even hotter than before. Yuri noted that this was the first time she'd seen someone wield 3 colors of mana. But then she smirked harder and declared she could also use body enhancement. Her aura blazed yellow as she tapped into her power, then with mana conversion she conjured a massive blue scythe. She declared to the protagonist that they would settle this once and for all. In a flash, she vanished and reappeared behind him, scythe already swinging. He barely managed to block, sword clashing against scythe. The protagonist realized instantly that her speed was insane. Yuri didn't let up, strike after strike rained down, and he matched each clash desperately. Finally, she swung her massive scythe down, obliterating the platform as he dodged away. He thought to himself how incredible her power was. But his mind raced and he plotted a countermeasure. Moving low, he snuck under her guard and grabbed her hand. Yuri scoffed, calling his move shallow. Even if he grabbed her hand, it meant nothing. But mid-sentence, her eyes widened, something was draining out of her. That instant, a system window appeared before the protagonist. Extreme body enhancement has been stolen. Yuri's strength faltered, her power slipping away. She staggered, clutching herself, muttering that her power was seeping out. The protagonist didn't waste the chance. He struck with a brutal palm thrust to her gut, making her cough violently as she stumbled backward. Weak and drained from losing her skill in that direct hit, Yuri admitted bitterly that he had been hiding his true power all along. Her knees buckled and moments later she collapsed to the ground. The protagonist stood tall above her as the examiner declared him the winner. And just like that, he realized he had won. The scene shifted, showing Yuri lying on a bed. She opened her eyes to find the protagonist and Ichinose standing there. The protagonist lit up with relief and excitement, saying she was finally awake. Yuri admitted it was her complete defeat, never expecting him to be that strong. She then assumed he hadn't come just to brag about his promotion. The protagonist answered sincerely, asking bluntly if she would part with them and join his side. Yuri was stunned at first, questioning what he meant, but the protagonist explained that based on the mock battle results she had also been promoted to a rank and that they needed her strength to conquer high-difficulty dungeons. That was why he wanted her in his party. At that, Yuri burst into laughter, startling him. Wiping tears from her eyes, she admitted he was truly interesting and agreed to follow him, saying it would be more fun. She shook his hand, promising she would be in the party. Just then, the building shook violently. Ichinose wondered aloud if it was an earthquake. The protagonist's expression twisted in horror as he looked outside, thinking it couldn't be what he feared. The scene shifted to a prison of chains, binding the god of space and time, Kronos. With a twitch of anger, Kronos muttered that it was almost time. The tremors suddenly stopped. Ichinose looked around in confusion, noting that it had ended, while the protagonist's mind raced back to the earthquakes that had preceded the collapse of the Ikebakuro dungeon before his regression. Time was running out. The dungeon's difficulty was unheard of in this era, but there was no choice. Determined, the protagonist gathered the two girls' attention and told them he wanted to conquer the Ikebukuro dungeon. Ichinose was shocked, demanding if he really meant the hardest dungeon in the Japanese peninsula and if he intended to take it on with only the three of them. Yuri, intrigued, asked if this decision was because of the quake. The protagonist confirmed with a serious tone, admitting he had a bad feeling. Reports of irregular monsters had been rising, and to him it felt like the prelude to something ominous. Yuri folded her legs, finding the idea interesting and agreeing without hesitation. Ichinose, wearing a determined expression, said she would do her best not to be a burden. The protagonist thanked them both, clenching his fist with resolve, declaring that they would do it together. The following day, the trio approached Hinata to ask a favor. When Hinata turned around, she saw the protagonist with Yuri and Ichinose. He told her straight they were going to conquer the Ikebukuro dungeon. Soon after, the scene shifted to the dungeon's entrance where the party stood gathered. Yuri remarked that it was a super difficult dungeon with a recommended level above 70, and she was thrilled. Ichinose, however, looked worried, pointing out that it would be better if they had other mages with them. The protagonist replied that it couldn't be helped. The association had no A-rank mages available right away. He added that it would have been great if Ohikawa were here. Yuri reacted to the name while the protagonist thought back to his past life, remembering that Ohikawa was the top-ranked mage in Japan and would have been a huge asset. He then turned his gaze, knowing that if the dungeon collapsed again, Kronos would appear. He resolved to stop it this time. With firm resolve, he told his party to move out. Before they entered, Yuri stopped him with a request. She asked to be called by her first name, saying her last name sounded too formal. Ichinose jumped in, wanting the same, her smile bright with excitement. Yuri pointed out that they were already friends and the protagonist agreed. He then called them both by their first names and rallied them, saying it was time to conquer the Ikebukuro dungeon. The party stepped inside, entering a cavern lined with glowing red crystals. Suddenly, the protagonist spotted a monster, a skull demon level 71. He was shocked. Such a monster was usually a boss elsewhere, yet here it appeared as a regular encounter. Resolute, he signaled Yuri and Ichinose to get ready. Both answered in sync as the trio charged forward. The skull demon instantly deployed its mana barrier. The protagonist quickly realized the barrier had to be destroyed first. He cast Fire Lance at it, but the attack barely scratched it. A single hit wasn't enough. He immediately called for Yuri and Ichinose to follow up. Yuri swung her scythe with deadly force while Ichinose unleashed a firewall. Together, their combined strike shattered the barrier wide open. Seizing the moment, the protagonist dashed forward and in a single clean motion cut the skull demon down with his sword. The monster collapsed, leaving behind a glowing green mana stone. The protagonist's expression lit up with relief and triumph. Ichinose cheered that they had done it, and the protagonist praised both of them, saying they fought well together. Right at that moment, Yuri turned to the protagonist and admitted that she had been wondering about something since their battle. She questioned him about how he could use so many skills. The protagonist was startled but decided it was finally time to come clean, confessing that he had something called skill drain. Both girls looked confused and Yuri pressed further, demanding to know what skill drain even was. The protagonist explained that just by touching someone he could steal their skill. Yuri immediately recalled her fight with him, realizing that this was what had happened back then. The protagonist reassured her, stating that he had already returned her skill. Yuri thanked him while Ichinose quietly observed the entire exchange, her thoughts racing. She realized in shock that he could even do that. She felt amazed by him, but her mind drifted to the time he mentioned conquering the Ikebakuro dungeon. Even though it had surprised her, she told herself that as long as he was here they would be fine. She resolved that she had to make sure she would never become a burden to the group. The party pressed deeper into the dungeon, defeating countless monsters with their unique skills. After clearing wave after wave, they finally arrived at the boss room. The protagonist acknowledged this with satisfaction, saying that the boss room was right ahead. Ichinose pointed out how the rumbling of the ground was getting louder. She knew boss monsters were strong, but she couldn't help questioning whether they were truly ready for this. The protagonist responded with steady confidence, explaining that their level had risen on the way here, so the fight should be doable. Ichinose admitted he was right, but in her heart she reflected that it was true he kept getting stronger after every fight, and Yuri was also adapting quickly to combat. She told herself she needed to at least support them, even if she couldn't match their strength. Still, Ichinose couldn't help looking down on herself. Just as she was lost in those thoughts, a tentacle suddenly slammed onto the ground behind her, shocking her completely. The sound made both the protagonist and Yuri whip around instantly. The tentacle lurched forward, sliding toward Ichinose. She turned back in panic just as it wrapped around her, seizing her in its grip. The protagonist shouted her name in worry as the truth revealed itself. The tentacle belonged to the boss monster of the Ikebakuro dungeon, Grim Weeper, a one-eyed tentacle beast whose level towered at 89. The protagonist stared at the monstrosity, his thoughts reeling. The boss should not have been able to leave its deepest room yet. So why was this even happening? Far above, the god of space and time, Kronos, was smiling, confirming it all. Yuri's voice cut through the chaos, questioning whether this wasn't already a disastrous situation. The protagonist acknowledged that it was true the circumstances were critical, but even so, he declared with unwavering determination that they had to save Ichinose no matter what. While the protagonist resolved that he was going to save Ichinose, Kronos, the god of time and space, was seen locked up and chained as before. Kronos internally chuckled, thinking the monster had been released. He grinned, admitting that this was the limit of what he could do with his current power, muttering, "Fine, I guess." Meanwhile, inside the dungeon, the boss monster Grim Reaper had clutched Ichinose into his tentacles. Kronos, amused, remarked that this would be the first victim of the grand opening. The protagonist was obviously worried about Ichinose, who was trapped in the clutches of the Grim Reaper. He questioned if she was okay, and as the view shifted, it revealed a glowing ball within which Ichinose was enclosed, while the tentacles of the boss monster struggled to destroy it. The tentacles trembled, unable to break through the glowing barrier. Ichinose assured herself she was somehow okay, though she thought she couldn't escape for long. She continued thinking about the protagonist and Yuri, hating the idea of being their dead weight. The protagonist, sweating and tense, thought about how Ichinose had instantly cast a mana barrier, but even with her massive mana pool, there was a limit to it. It was revealed that the glowing ball was Ichinose's mana barrier. The protagonist considered using his abyss flames, but hesitated, realizing Ichinose would get caught in the crossfire. He had to find another way to save her. Calling out to Yuri, he decided he would draw the tentacle's attention while Yuri tried to rescue Ichinose in the meantime. Yuri readied her scythe, thinking she had no other choice, and both bolted toward the Grim Reaper. But the Grim Reaper wasn't about to let that happen. He whipped his tentacles, slamming them down. The tentacle crashed where the protagonist had been, but he dodged midair, realizing that a normal attack from this creature had that much destructive power. He couldn't afford to take a direct hit. He landed on the ground after dodging, but the earth cracked behind him and another tentacle emerged from his blind spot. Seeing this, he thought it came from behind. Ichinose, filled with worry, called his name. At that instant, the protagonist cast a mana hand spell, grabbing a chunk of the dungeon floor to propel himself away, dodging again at the last second. He thought that the tentacle had been dangerously close, but he managed to evade it. Meanwhile, Yuri dashed toward the Grim Reaper, smirking that this much distraction was enough. In the next second, she leapt high, rearing back her scythe before descending upon the tentacles with a full-force attack. But both she and the protagonist were stunned. The tentacle didn't even have a scratch. They both thought it might be some kind of strengthening skill. Yuri backed off since her attack clearly hadn't worked, and the protagonist also retreated, calling out to check if she was okay. Yuri replied that she was fine, no problem. Standing before the Grim Reaper, the protagonist remarked internally that something was off. Yuri agreed. The protagonist analyzed the situation. Tentacle-type monsters usually had low defense, and he'd never heard of one possessing a strengthening skill, especially one that could wander outside the boss room. Something was definitely strange. As he pondered this, Kronos smiled mischievously, clearly the one behind it. The Grim Reaper lashed out again, sending another tentacle strike toward the protagonist, giving him no time to think. The protagonist and Yuri were forced into defense, fending off tentacles coming from all directions. Watching this from within her barrier, Ichinose blamed herself, thinking it was all her fault. She thought about how she'd always relied on the protagonist, how he made every battle easier, how she'd always told herself that as long as he was there, everything would be fine. She realized she'd been too passive. Slamming her fist in frustration against the mana barrier, she thought she needed to do something, but she couldn't. Meanwhile, Yuri was fending off another tentacle attack, chuckling grimly to herself that things were really bad. The protagonist was also struggling, realizing that both his and Yuri's mana were almost depleted after constant fighting. He thought that if only their mana were in perfect condition, things would be different. Then his gaze shifted to Ichinose trapped above and an idea sparked. He called out to Ichinose, telling her to use her mana fusion on them. Ichinose was taken aback by the request. Yuri, hearing this, noted that the skill was considered useless since it consumed a massive amount of mana. But the protagonist, fighting off tentacles, thought back to his past life. It was true that mana fusion had been considered useless then too, until a certain mage proved its worth. That mage had been Ichinose herself, the one who turned its value around, the Scarlet King. Ichinose, still trapped, thought about mana fusion, a skill she'd never used because she believed it to be useless, but if the protagonist said so, then she'd believe him. More than that, she wanted to. Clenching her fist, she made up her mind. In the next instant, she activated mana fusion, channeling her power to help the protagonist. The mana flowed from Ichinose toward the protagonist and Yuri, revitalizing their depleted energy as the tide of battle began to shift. Yuri was shocked, realizing that her mana was recovering, while the protagonist smiled and explained that mana fusion had an effect that shared the mana of the user. It was a skill that only a mage with a massive amount of mana could master. But there was a slight hesitation flickering across the protagonist's face, as Ichinose thought how amazing it was that, with this skill of hers, she could share her mana with both the protagonist and Yuri. However, she quickly noticed that this much wasn't enough since she was still using her mana barrier to protect herself from the monster. A sudden resolve ignited in her expression, and she made a bold decision, erasing her mana barrier entirely. In the next second, both Yuri and the protagonist were taken aback, completely shocked that Ichinose had actually dropped her barrier. The consequence came fast. The tentacles grouped together, coiling around Ichinose's body and gripping her tight. But in that final second of struggle, Ichinose cast Blast Furnace, determined to recover more mana for the protagonist and Yuri. Her mana flowed toward them, swirling in a luminous rush of power. The protagonist was both shocked and worried, realizing she had ramped up her skill output using Blast Furnace, all while he shouted her name in desperation. Ichinose used up the last of her strength, her thoughts echoing softly as she called both their names, saying she'd leave the rest to them. The next moment, the tentacles that had wrapped around her swallowed her whole. The protagonist, now dead serious, called out to Yuri, who matched his energy instantly. She affirmed his intent, and in that split second they understood each other perfectly. Together, they dashed straight toward the Grim Reaper, determination blazing. Yuri, inspired by Ichinose's resolve, thought that if Ichinose could show that much determination, then she had no choice but to do the same. The protagonist, equally fired up, mentally thanked Yuri as they both closed the distance between themselves and the gigantic, octopus-like monster. In a synchronized motion, they went crisscross, slashing the hell out of the creature's tentacles like they were nothing, powered by their restored mana and sheer determination to end this fight here and now. They cut a path through the storm of limbs, hacking through the Grim Reaper's writhing tentacles with wild precision. The protagonist thought that thanks to Ichinose, who had restored their mana, they could now penetrate its defense with their enhancement skills easily. Fueled by that momentum, the protagonist mentally declared that they would save Ichinose, and Yuri agreed. Ichinose was still trapped between the tentacles, and the protagonist tried to reach her. The tentacles lifted Ichinose above, and as the protagonist approached, another attack lashed out, forcing him to back away. The Grim Reaper now held Ichinose like a hostage, its slimy tendrils wrapped around her menacingly. The protagonist thought that at this rate they wouldn't be able to reach her. But then Yuri called out to him, telling him to leave it to her, she'd open a path forward. Blue magic flared around her, bursting like an aurora as she cast her spell. In the next second, stairs made of pure mana appeared, leading directly toward Ichinose. The protagonist realized she had crafted stairs from her mana barrier, and with that he dashed forward, sprinting up the glowing steps while silently thanking Yuri. Of course, the Grim Reaper wasn't going to just let him climb. Using its monstrous tentacles, it tried to block his ascent. But the protagonist, now pissed off at this octopus freak, didn't give a damn. He swung his sword mercilessly, slashing through every tentacle in his way, the creature's dark blood splattering everywhere. Then in a sharp, decisive move, he sliced through the tentacle holding Ichinose hostage and caught her in his arms as they both plummeted down. Ichinose was unconscious when they landed, holding her close and checking if she was okay. Ichinose slowly opened her eyes, and a faint smile curved her lips as she told him he really lived up to expectations. The protagonist was relieved beyond words, and Yuri soon joined them, smiling as she told Ichinose that she'd saved them both with her mana recovery, thanking her sincerely. But Ichinose, the pure, kind, and innocent soul she was, replied that it should be her thanking them instead. Yuri grinned, praising Ichinose for her guts, to which Ichinose smiled and thanked her back, though she quickly added that they weren't done yet. The protagonist confirmed that the monster's body was still left, and sure enough, the Grim Reaper was still there, battered but far from defeated. Its severed tentacles twitched, then suddenly regenerated as if they had never been cut in the first place. The monstrous limbs lashed out again, descending upon the protagonist and Yuri, who both narrowly dodged. The protagonist was stunned that the tentacles could regenerate. It was beyond annoying. One sharp tendril shot from the ground toward Yuri, but she dodged and sliced it cleanly with her scythe. Then she called out to the protagonist, thinking that at this rate the situation would only get worse if they didn't act fast. The protagonist paused for a moment, deep in thought, before calling out to Yuri, deciding that he would handle things himself. Yuri appeared suspicious of the idea, her expression mixed with frustration but eventual acceptance, as she realized they didn't have much time to deal with the situation anyway. The protagonist then slammed his sword into the ground with a fierce jolt, his resolve unshaken even without a weapon in hand, silently vowing to finish it off himself. Yuri's eyes widened in disbelief as she watched him charge straight toward the Grim Reaper's main body with nothing but his bare hands. She couldn't help but wonder what on earth he was planning. Another one of the Reaper's monstrous tentacles whipped past, aiming to strike him, but the protagonist dodged with sharp precision. At this point, he was already used to those tentacle attacks. He reminded himself that the creature would probably regenerate even after being hit by his abyss flame, but he had a plan. In the next moment, he activated Overclock. Purple engravings flared behind him like glowing circuitry, pulsing with raw energy. Because of the overclock, his firepower doubled, and immediately after, he began gathering black mana around his hands. Standing tall like some dark entity straight out of a nightmare, he thought this would finally end it. The Grim Reaper shrieked with its monstrous mouth wide open as the protagonist's deadly gaze locked onto it. With burning determination, he unleashed his abyss flames, shooting them from his hands toward the grotesque octopus-like creature. The flames streaked through the air, converging at a single point near the Grim Reaper. The creature realized too late that it was done for. In the next second, the concentrated abyss flame pierced straight through its body, creating a massive hole. The Grim Reaper collapsed, lifeless, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The protagonist, drained and exhausted from using that much magic, could barely stay upright. Meanwhile, Kronos' expression twisted with rage, the fury clearly written across his face. He scoffed in disbelief, thinking that he never expected the Grim Reaper to be defeated. His anger boiled over as his eyes glowed with malevolence, silently promising that he would make sure the protagonist never left alive. Deep within that dungeon, the Grim Reaper lay dead, and the party gathered around the fallen creature. Ichinose turned toward the protagonist, congratulating him on the victory, and he casually returned the compliment, saying it was thanks to her too. But before they could even process their win, blackish-purple blood began oozing from the Grim Reaper's corpse, slithering like a sentient liquid straight toward Ichinose. The protagonist noticed it instantly, shouting a mental warning for her to watch out. The party narrowly avoided being struck as the substance stopped just short of them, releasing clouds of steam that hissed ominously. The protagonist realized that the liquid was leaking directly from the Grim Reaper's body. Then in an instant, a much larger wave of that same dark substance erupted, surging toward the group. The protagonist yelled for everyone to run. As they sprinted through the dungeon, panic surged among them. No one knew what the hell that thing was. He admitted that he had no idea either, but insisted they needed to get out immediately. The blackish-purple liquid chased after them relentlessly as they bolted for their lives. He thought to himself that while they had managed to stop the dungeon from collapsing, dying here would make all of it meaningless. The exit finally came into view and they pushed harder, trying to reach it, but the dark liquid was already ahead of them, cutting off their path. Ichinose looked horrified, and the protagonist felt that same sinking dread, thinking they were completely screwed. But then out of nowhere, a voice echoed through the space, commanding them to step aside. In the very next second, a massive wall of golden magic materialized in front of them, blocking the deadly liquid and saving them from certain death. The barrier shimmered with divine intensity, keeping the blackish-purple mass at bay. Ichinose stood frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what just happened. Then a figure stepped forward from behind the golden glow, remarking with casual confidence that it was a close call. The protagonist turned toward the newcomer, his eyes narrowing as he wondered who the hell this person was. Emerging from the light was a man with striking golden hair, a sleek black jacket, and the unmistakable aura of a seasoned veteran.